quote that goes something like, "The worst thing in life is becoming the enemy you sought to destroy." Now, what I'm really showing in this speech is how the affirmative team, in an effort to combat human rights abuses in Russia, they are, in a sense, becoming the very thing they are seeking to get rid of. But first off, let's start off with some topicality. Now, in debate, we have a resolution. This resolution sort of sets the stage for what we debate about. This year, the resolution is talking about U.S. policy towards Russia. Now, as they admitted in cross-examination, the affirmative team must be within the balance of this resolution for you as the judge to have the ability to vote for them. So the first instance in where they are non-topical is their first mandate. Now, the standard here, or really what they have to do to be topical, is that the policy must be based in U.S. action. The advantages also have to be achieved from U.S. action. The violation here is that their first mandate, if you look at it, it entirely relies on Russian action, not the U.S. action towards Russia. It proposes a policy and then has Russia act. If you actually look at the stipulations of the treaty proposed, it's entirely Russia. Their first stipulation: Russia will destroy their stockpile weapons that exceed a 1% failure rate. 2, the U.S. gives Russia $2 billion in the treaty. 3, by 2018, Russia will verify through testing under field conditions that their weapons are fine. 4, Russia will agree to use, produce, and export only the cluster bombs that use 90% reliability rate technology after 2018. All the stipulations in the treaty they propose to the Russian government rely on Russian action, not the U.S. action. The impact here is that, 1, you as the judge have no jurisdiction to vote for the affirmative team because they rely outside the bounds of the resolution. The second impact is they cannot access their advantages. Their advantages are based entirely on Russian action, which they can't fiat. They can only use the federal government to change a policy, which is where their advantages come from. Their advantages should be coming from the U.S. government policy change and not the Russian government policy change. So with that first mandate out of the way, let's look at their second mandate. I'm going to read it to you right now. They said the same withholding tax of 30% will be implemented on the portfolio interest income earned by Russian investors if the Russian government does not ratify this treaty. The standard here is that your policy changes occur between governments, not between the people residing in a geographical landmark. This policy change right here is toward actually Russian investors. This is in no way a policy change towards Russia, which is the Russian government. The violation here is, again, you're towards investors and not the actual Russian government. The impact, again, is you're non-topical. Now, I'd like to bring up a really important disadvantage about the second mandate. And this is really the crux of their case right here, the fact that if they have no enforcement for getting Russia to sign this treaty, they have absolutely no plan whatsoever. However, we see that this enforcement right here by taxing the investors is absolutely the wrong way to go about enforcing the treaty. The first link here is just obvious, that they tax Russian investors if Russia doesn't sign. The second link is that creates an oppressive business climate for the U.S. Essentially, what we're saying is all you Russian investors have already invested in us, we're going to tax your incomes and your earnings because the Russian government isn't doing something that we want them to do. It's entirely oppressive, and actually, ironically enough, the internal link here is the same as Russia. Russia has an oppressive business climate, which is why a lot of countries don't want to invest there, and the Russian investors, instead of investing in their own economy, are investing in the U.S. economy. So it's really a turn here, again, as I was saying with the opening quote, becoming the enemy you sought to destroy. We are, in a sense, creating an oppressive business climate that we incredibly condemn and disapprove of in Russia. Now let's look at the impacts to this disadvantage. The first impact is lawsuits. This is incredibly obvious. You have these Russian investors who've invested in the U.S. economy. They have poured their earnings into our companies. Now we're saying, because their government isn't doing something that we want them to do, we're imposing this on them. The investors have to suffer. Now when they invested, you have essentially a freedom of disclosure. When you invest in the stock market, you know what you're going to get back. You know all the tax rates, you know all that. However, the affirmative team is coming in and saying, hey, we have a new tax rate that we didn't tell you about because we just created it. The Russians are going to sue us, and we are going to lose because it's entirely against the entire foundation of the U.S. investing stock market laws. The second impact here is that other Russian investors won't invest in us. Those who have invested aren't going to come towards us. This piece of evidence right here comes from Clayton K. Uter. He said in 1997, I quote, "Today the United States accounts for 20% of the world's exports of agricultural equipment and 16% of the world's exports of telecommunications equipment. That doesn't matter. However, the offending countries, if they commit something that the U.S. doesn't approve of, need not buy such products from us. The most likely impact of unilateral sanctions is simply to hand markets over to foreign competitors. Now, let me explain this card to you. When it says unilateral sanctions, a unilateral sanction is traditionally thought of as a tax on Russia's imports from the U.S. However, it can just as equally mean a tax on their investors investing in us, because that's essentially what trade is. So when you are sanctioning or when you are taxing their investors, they don't need to invest in us. They can leave and go elsewhere, and that's exactly what they'll do. My third impact is that other countries won't invest in us. So they see that we've just thrown this discriminatory policy on these Russian investors. They say, so are we going to keep our investment in Russia, or is that where we're going to keep our funds? Of course not. They're going to go and rush in other economic superpowers, such as China, Brazil, India, and so forth. Because they see that oppressive climate right there for the U.S. economic business, stock market, they're going to invest elsewhere. The fifth impact here is that you are abusing rights. Now this kind of goes back to the internal link. You have various human rights, which is life, liberty, property. Now they focus on their case on life, of course, and that's great. I completely agree with that. That's a very important facet of human rights. But another important facet is that of property. This is the Russians' property. The Russian individual citizens' property is in our stock market. However, we're saying we're taking that from you. The U.S. government is essentially becoming the big bad wolf that Russia's acting like. The fact that we are becoming that, it's completely hypocritical and in a sense destroys our entire foundation for the entire case. Now the sixth impact here is that the U.S. companies are actually going to be hurt by this. Why? Because one, the Russians are going to leave, no other people are going to invest in us, therefore the U.S. businesses are hurt. What are they going to do? They're going to leave the country. Why would they stay in a country that hurts their stock market? They would not. They're going to move elsewhere. So really we see here that the affirmative team's case is based entirely around their enforcement, which is the tax on Russian investors. However, this is going to be entirely detrimental to the U.S. image, to our economy, and is discriminatory toward the actual Russian citizens, and is not the way to go about it. The solvency here is that you should be addressing the Russian government. You should be punishing the Russian government if you think they're doing something wrong, not their citizens. The citizens have no way to say about the cluster bombs the Russian government is using. Now my last argument here is an advocacy press. Nowhere in their 1AC did the affirmative team present evidence saying that this plan would ever work. To actually have a plan, you have to show that someone says this would work. This is entirely the affirmative team's own thinking and reasoning, and we see here that because of this, it's resulting in a massive disadvantage. So, if you don't want to become that big bad wolf, don't vote for the affirmative team. Thank you.
Are the judges ready? Good afternoon, Joe. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
All right. Now, first on your advocacy press, saying that we don't have someone actually specifically advocating our policy.
Yeah.
Isn't it true we did provide experts saying that the current U.S. 1% policy would balance humanitarian interests with military?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so we did have an advocate in that sense.
No, I don't think that's an advocate. I think that you said that this might be a good idea, the 1% fail rate, but your actual plan, your policy change, is nowhere advocating for anything.
Okay, thank you. So are you saying that advocacy press specifically comes when dealing with the issue of enforcement? That we don't have anyone advocating the issue of enforcement?
Well, no, I believe that's one area, but also if you look at your first meeting, the bilateral treaty, we see that no one has recommended this. You have advocates saying that cluster bombs should not fail it, or should not fail as much as they do, but you don't have an advocate saying that the U.S. should actually propose this bilateral treaty with all the stipulations.
Thank you. We'll be addressing that later. All right. Now, is this treaty being proposed to Russia by the U.S.?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you bring up a definition of Russia, the term Russia meaning it would exclude its own citizens?
No, I don't believe that Russia excludes its own citizens, but when you're dealing in a foreign policy realm, the government does not make policies towards individual citizens or groups of citizens.
Okay.
It makes policy towards other countries.
Okay. Now, is this your own interpretation that the term Russia means that the citizens are excluded?
I think it's a foreign policy interpretation.
Okay. Did you bring any evidence, or is that your own foreign policy?
No, I did not.
Okay, thank you. Now, did you give a reason why our interpretation of Russia, including Russians, is inferior to your interpretation?
Yes, I did, because the fact is that when you're dealing with foreign policy, you're not tolerable because you actually have to deal with the government. That's the way foreign policy works.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you please rephrase disadvantage 1, just the tagline of that?
Disadvantage 1 is that in a sense you're becoming the enemy, the human rights abuser that you try to protect, that you're trying
Okay.
to get rid of. I mean, there are a lot of impacts there.
Okay,
you
could you give me the taglines for the impacts really
the
quick?
impacts, the first impact is that of lawsuits, that the Russian citizens are actually going to sue us.
Did you read evidence up to this point?
No, I didn't.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Keep going with your...
My second impact was that other Russian investors who haven't invested with us won't invest with us.
Okay.
The third impact was that other countries won't invest with us because they see our friendly business climate. Fourth impact is that U.S. companies are hurt.
Okay.
Fifth impact was that they'll actually leave because of that.
Okay.
They'll relocate. And sixth impact was that you're abusing human rights of the Russian citizens.
Okay, how many of these points had evidence to back them up?
I believe one of them had an actual quote.
Okay.
The others had a different form of evidence, which is just logic.
Okay, could I see that one?
Yes, you can.
All right. Now this card on unilateral sanctions, the one you
Yeah.
just gave me, I believe, is that specific to Russia?
No, it's not.
Okay, is it specific to a tax on investors?
It's specific towards a tax or a sanction
Okay.
on other countries.
Okay. Did you provide any evidence that Russia will not sign our treaty?
Nope.
Okay, thank you.